Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of the fall of Lance Armstrong. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are stories that unfold like morning fog lifting from a valley, slowly, inevitably, revealing landscapes we thought we knew but somehow never really saw. The Lance Armstrong story is one of these, a tale that begins with the golden light of triumph and ends in the long shadows of revelation, where heroes become cautionary tales and legends crumble like ancient parchment in our hands. I want to take you on a journey through this story, not as journalists rushing to deadline or prosecutors building a case, but as travelers moving through the ruins of what was once considered the greatest comeback story in sports history. We'll walk slowly through these corridors of memory, examining the artifacts of a dream that became a nightmare, touching the textures of ambition and deception, feeling the weight of what it means when our gods prove mortal. Picture, if you will, the summer of 1999. The world was preparing for a new millennium. Y2K fears whispered in the background, and in France something miraculous was unfolding on the winding roads of the Tour de France. Lance Edward Armstrong, a young man from Texas who had stared death in the face and somehow found the strength to laugh, was riding toward a destiny that would make him the most celebrated athlete of his generation. The bicycle beneath him was more than machine. It was extension, it was prayer wheel. It was the vessel carrying not just a man, but a story that the world desperately wanted to believe. Here was cancer, that most feared of words, transformed into triumph. Here was the human spirit, distilled to its purest essence, pedaling up mountains that had broken lesser men, racing toward a yellow jersey that symbolized more than victory. It symbolized possibility itself. Armstrong's legs pumped with metronomic precision, each stroke a defiance of the tumors that had once colonized his body like invading armies. His lungs, which had been punctured and scarred, now pulled in the thin mountain air with the efficiency of a precision engine. His heart, which had raced not with exertion but with terror in hospital rooms, now beat the steady rhythm of a man who had learned that every heartbeat is a gift. The crowds along the roadside were not merely spectators. They were witnesses to what felt like a resurrection. They pressed against the barriers, reaching out to touch not just a cyclist, but a living embodiment of hope. Their voices rose in waves of encouragement that seemed to lift Armstrong's wheels from the asphalt, carrying him forward on currents of collective faith. In those golden hours of that first victory, as Armstrong crossed finish lines with arms raised to the heavens, as he stood on podiums draped in yellow while anthems played and cameras flashed, the world was not just watching a bicycle race. We were participating in a mythology, a story so perfect in its narrative arc that it seemed almost scripted by Providence itself. The young man who had been given a 40% chance of survival was now standing atop the world. And in that moment, anything seemed possible for any of us. The yellow jersey draped across his shoulders was more than fabric. It was a shroud of invincibility, a golden fleece that proved dragons could be slayed and mountains moved. When Armstrong raised that first trophy above his head, when the champagne caught the light like liquid diamonds, when the crowd's roar seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, we were all lifting that trophy with him. We were all conquering our own mountains. What we built around Lance Armstrong in those years was more than fandom. It was a cathedral of belief, constructed with the careful precision of master craftsmen working in the medium of hope. Each victory was another stone in the foundation, each mountain stage another flying buttress supporting the soaring spires of his legend. And at the center of it all, like a golden altar, sat the narrative that had captured the world's imagination. The cancer survivor who had not merely returned to competition but had transcended it. The Live Strong brand became more than marketing. It was scripture, a yellow gospel that promised resurrection to the afflicted. Those simple yellow rubber bracelets, worn by millions around the world, were not merely accessories but prayer beads, rosaries of resilience that connected the wearer to something larger than themselves. To wear one was to declare faith in the impossible, to announce to the world that you believed in miracles. Armstrong's foundation raised hundreds of millions of dollars, funding research and support programs that touched countless lives. The irony would later taste bitter in our mouths. That genuine good grew from what we now know was the soil of deception. But in those years, the foundation was holy ground, a place where suffering was transformed into purpose, where the darkness of diagnosis was alchemized into the gold of healing. The annual rides and events drew thousands of participants, each carrying their own stories of survival, their own battles with mortality. They came not just to ride, but to commune, to touch the hem of a garment that seemed blessed with protective powers. Armstrong would appear at these events like a secular saint, his presence alone enough to validate every struggle, every small victory, every reason to keep fighting. Television cameras loved him, finding in his story the perfect intersection of drama and inspiration. Documentary crews followed him through his training, capturing what appeared to be the monastic discipline of a man who had learned to treat each day as sacred. The footage showed early morning rides through empty streets, the discipline of diet and training regimen, the almost spiritual focus that seemed to transform the mundane act of bicycle riding into something approaching transcendence. Journalists wrote about him in language typically reserved for religious figures or mythological heroes. He was called the Miracle of Austin, the Yellow Messiah, the man who rode back from death. Magazine covers featured him not just as an athlete, but as an inspiration, a living proof that the human spirit could triumph over any adversity. The stories crafted around him had the structure of classical mythology, the hero's journey, the descent into darkness, the resurrection, the triumphant return. And we, the faithful, consumed these stories with the hunger of believers seeking affirmation. We needed Lance Armstrong to be real, to be pure, to be exactly what he appeared to be. In a world increasingly complex and morally ambiguous, he offered clarity, the simple, powerful story of good triumphing over evil, of will conquering circumstance, of the individual human soul proving itself capable of miracles. The architecture of this faith was built to last forever. Its foundations were sunk deep in our collective need to believe in something greater than ourselves. Its walls were mortared with testimonials and evidence that seemed unshakable. Its roof was held aloft by the sheer force of our wanting it to be true. But even the most magnificent cathedrals can fall, and when they do, the sound they make echoes through history like the toll of a funeral bell. Behind the cameras, away from the cheering crowds and the golden light of victory, another story was being written in the shadowed corners of hotel rooms, in the sterile precision of medical facilities, in conversations conducted in whispers and code words. This was the story that would eventually bring down the cathedral we had built, but for years it remained hidden in the margins, dismissed as the bitter gossip of the defeated, the conspiracy theories of those who could not accept that miracles sometimes do occur. The world of professional cycling in the 1990s and early 2000s was a place where the human body was treated as both temple and laboratory, where the pursuit of excellence had evolved into something that transcended traditional notions of sport. The margins of victory at the highest levels had become so thin that athletes and their support teams began to explore realms that previous generations had considered forbidden territory. In this world, blood was not just the life force that carried oxygen to working muscles. It was a substance to be manipulated, concentrated, stored, and reinfused like a vintage wine being decanted at the perfect moment. EPO, erythropoietin, became not just a medical treatment for anemia, but a philosopher's stone that could transform ordinary blood into liquid performance, turning the human cardiovascular system into a precision instrument capable of operating at superhuman levels. The process itself had an almost ritualistic quality. In the pre-dawn darkness of hotel rooms, medical professionals would appear like priests conducting a sacred ceremony. Needles would find veins with practiced precision, drawing blood that would be spun in centrifuges until it separated into its component parts. The red blood cells, concentrated and purified, would be stored like sacramental wine, waiting for the moment when they would be returned to the body to provide the extra oxygen-carrying capacity that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Armstrong's relationship with Dr. Michele Ferrari, the Italian physician who would become central to the doping allegations, was painted by supporters as that of a dedicated athlete working with a brilliant sports scientist. Ferrari's reputation was that of a man who understood the human body at a level that bordered on the mystical, who could fine-tune an athlete's physiology like a master mechanic working on a Formula One engine. The training camps, conducted in remote locations away from the prying eyes of media and anti-doping officials, took on the quality of monastic retreats. Here, surrounded by mountains and silence, the alchemy of transformation would occur. Days would be spent pushing the body to its absolute limits, exploring the boundaries between human endurance and human breakdown. Evenings would be devoted to recovery protocols that involved not just rest and nutrition, but carefully timed medical interventions designed to accelerate the body's natural healing processes. The language used to describe these activities was deliberately clinical, almost poetic in its precision. Blood values were discussed like wine vintages, with connoisseurs debating the subtle differences between various enhancement protocols. Training zones were mapped with the precision of military campaigns, with every aspect of preparation choreographed to achieve maximum impact. Yet, even as this shadow world operated with increasing sophistication, those within it seemed to maintain a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance. They were not cheating, they told themselves and each other. They were simply optimizing, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, exploring the very limits of human potential. They were pioneers, not criminals, adventurers in the frontier territory between athletic achievement and scientific innovation. The moral framework they constructed to justify these actions was elaborate and internally consistent. Everyone was doing it, they reasoned, so the playing field remained level. The rules were outdated, written by people who didn't understand the modern realities of elite competition. What they were doing was not fundamentally different from altitude training or wind tunnel testing. They were simply using all available tools to maximize performance. And, perhaps most importantly, the results spoke for themselves. Armstrong's dominance was not just impressive, it was transcendent. He didn't just win races, he redefined what winning meant. His performances had a quality that seemed to justify whatever methods had produced them, as if the very magnificence of the outcome sanctified the means by which it had been achieved. In this laboratory of dreams, where the boundaries between medicine and sport had dissolved, where the human body had become both canvas and sculpture, Lance Armstrong was being transformed into something more than human. But, as the alchemists of old discovered, the pursuit of perfection often comes with a price that only becomes clear when it's too late to pay it. 7 consecutive Tour de France victories. 7 times, Lance Armstrong stood on the top step of the podium in Paris, the Champs-Élysées stretching behind him like a golden carpet, while the yellow jersey draped his shoulders with the weight of legend. 7 times, the world watched in wonder as this man who had survived cancer continued to rewrite the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. Each victory carried its own texture, its own particular flavor of triumph. The second win, in 2000, had the sweet taste of confirmation, proof that the first had not been a fluke, that this was not just a beautiful anomaly, but the beginning of something unprecedented. Armstrong's margin of victory that year was commanding, decisive, leaving no room for doubt about his superiority in the mountains and against the clock. The third victory, in 2001, came with an edge of controversy that would prove prophetic. Whispers followed Armstrong through that tour like shadows at noon, difficult to see clearly, but impossible to ignore completely. A French television documentary had raised questions about his association with Dr. Ferrari, about training methods that seemed to exist in the gray areas between legal and illegal, about performances that struck some observers as almost supernatural in their consistency. But Armstrong faced these challenges with the same steely determination that had carried him through cancer treatments. He was not just defending yellow jerseys, he was defending the entire narrative that had made him a global icon. His responses to critics were sharp, decisive, delivered with the confidence of a man who knew that his accusers could produce nothing more than suspicion and innuendo, while he could point to test results that showed no evidence of prohibited substances. The fourth victory, in 2002, had the quality of establishment. Armstrong was no longer just a cancer survivor who had returned to win bike races. He was becoming the most dominant Tour de France rider in history, mentioned in the same breath as the legendary Eddy Merckx and Miguel Indurain. His tactical intelligence had evolved to match his physical capabilities, and he seemed to understand not just how to suffer, but how to make his competitors suffer more. The fifth victory, in 2003, brought him level with the greatest riders in the sport's history. Only 4 men had ever won the Tour de France 5 times, and Armstrong had now joined this most exclusive of clubs. The victory came after what many considered his most challenging tour, with closest competitors pushing him harder than he had been pushed in years. But in the crucial mountain stages, when legends are either born or broken, Armstrong demonstrated once again that he possessed something that transcended mere physical ability, a kind of psychological dominance that seemed to crush his opponent's will before they even began to climb. The sixth victory, in 2004, was perhaps the most emotionally resonant. Armstrong had announced that the following year would be his last, that he would retire at the peak of his powers to focus on his foundation work and his growing family. This victory had the bittersweet quality of approaching farewell, and the crowds that lined the French roadsides seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would never be repeated. And then came 2005, and with it the 7th victory that would define Armstrong's place in sporting immortality. The farewell tour was conducted like a victory lap that lasted 3 weeks, with Armstrong savoring each stage, each mountain pass, each moment of what he knew would be his final dance with the race that had given him everything. When he crossed the finish line in Paris for the last time as a competitor, when he climbed onto that podium for the seventh and final time, the yellow jersey seemed to glow with an almost supernatural radiance. The weight of those 7 yellow jerseys was not just physical, it was the accumulated mass of hope and inspiration that millions of people had invested in Armstrong's story. Each jersey represented not just a victory in a bicycle race, but a triumph of the human spirit over adversity. They were relics of a secular saint, proof that faith could move mountains, and that cancer need not be a death sentence. In the months and years that followed his retirement, those 7 jerseys would hang in various places, sometimes in his home, sometimes on display at foundation events, sometimes locked away in storage. But wherever they were, they carried with them the weight of what they represented. The greatest individual achievement in the history of cycling, accomplished by a man who had every reason to never race a bicycle again. Yet weight, as any physicist will tell you, is a function not just of mass, but of the gravitational field in which that mass exists. And as the gravitational field around Lance Armstrong's story began to shift, as the very foundations of reality started to crack and buckle, those 7 yellow jerseys would begin to feel not like trophies, but like anchors, dragging their bearer down into depths from which there would be no return. In the years following Armstrong's retirement, something began to shift in the atmospheric pressure surrounding his legend. It was subtle at first, like the way the light changes before a storm, when the sky is still blue but the air itself seems to hold its breath. Former teammates began to speak in ways that would have been unthinkable during the glory years, their words carrying undertones that suggested stories yet to be told. Floyd Landis, Armstrong's former teammate who had won the 2006 Tour de France only to be stripped of the victory for doping violations, began to emerge from his own shadows with increasingly bold statements. His allegations, when they first surfaced, were met with the same dismissive responses that had greeted all previous accusations. But Landis possessed something that earlier critics had lacked: intimate knowledge of the inner workings of Armstrong's team, detailed understanding of methods and procedures that had previously been protected by omerta, the code of silence that governed professional cycling's darkest corners. The United States Anti-Doping Agency, under the leadership of Travis Tygart, began to assemble what would become one of the most comprehensive investigations in the history of sport. Tygart was not a man given to dramatic gestures or media-friendly sound bites. He was methodical, patient, driven by what appeared to be an almost moral conviction that the truth, however uncomfortable, must eventually be revealed. The investigation proceeded with the slow, inexorable pace of justice. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was gathered. Testimonies were recorded and cross-referenced. Former teammates, mechanics, doctors, and support staff were brought before investigators to tell their stories under oath. The picture that emerged from these sessions was not the heroic narrative that the world had embraced, but something far more complex and troubling. Tyler Hamilton, another former teammate, published a book titled The Secret Race that pulled back the curtain on what he claimed was a systematic doping program operating at the highest levels of professional cycling. Hamilton's account was detailed, specific, and deeply personal. He wrote not as a bitter ex-teammate seeking revenge, but as a man struggling to come to terms with his own participation in activities that he now recognized as fundamentally corrupt. The testimony of these former teammates was particularly damaging because it came from men who had nothing obvious to gain from lying. They had already been sanctioned for their own doping violations. Their careers were over. Their reputations were in ruins. They were speaking out, they claimed, not from malice but from a need to unburden themselves of secrets that had become too heavy to carry. Meanwhile, Armstrong himself remained largely silent, speaking only through lawyers who issued carefully worded denials that parsed language with surgical precision. He did not deny that doping occurred within professional cycling. Such a denial would have been impossible to maintain. But he continued to maintain his own innocence with a steadfastness that began to seem less like integrity and more like stubbornness. The investigation expanded beyond individual testimony to examine financial records, travel documents, medical records, and communication logs. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic planning and execution, a sophisticated operation that had operated for years with military-like precision and security. As 2012 progressed, the storm clouds that had been gathering on the horizon began to move closer to shore. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of change, the electricity of impending revelation. Those who had defended Armstrong most fiercely began to speak in more qualified terms, their absolute certainty giving way to something that sounded suspiciously like preparation for disappointment. The Live Strong Foundation, sensing the changing weather, began to distance itself from its founder, removing his name from various programs and events. Sponsors started to include morality clauses in their contracts, creating legal escape routes should the unthinkable become inevitable. And through it all, Armstrong continued to train, to participate in endurance events, to maintain the physical discipline that had defined his life for decades. But his rides now took on a different quality. They seemed less like celebrations of human potential, and more like a man trying to outrun his own shadow, pedaling furiously toward a horizon that seemed to recede with every revolution of his wheels. The storm was coming, and everyone knew it. The only question was how devastating it would be when it finally made landfall, and whether anything of the legend would survive the winds that were about to tear through the carefully constructed monument to human triumph that Lance Armstrong had become. October 22, 2012. The date itself would become a historical marker, dividing time into before and after, into the age of belief and the age of revelation. On this day, the United States Anti-Doping Agency released its reasoned decision in the case of Lance Armstrong, a 1,000-page document that would prove to be not just an indictment of an individual athlete, but an autopsy of an entire era. The document did not arrive with fanfare or dramatic presentation. It was released quietly, posted on a website, made available to journalists and the public as a PDF file that could be downloaded like any other bureaucratic report. But within its pages lay the accumulated weight of years of investigation, hundreds of hours of testimony, and evidence so comprehensive and devastating that it would leave no room for doubt, no space for denial, no possibility of return. The language of the report was clinical, almost antiseptic in its precision. But behind the careful legal terminology lay human stories of corruption and coercion, of a system so sophisticated and pervasive that it had transformed one of the world's most beloved sports into an elaborate theater of deception. The report described not just individual acts of doping, but an entire culture built around the systematic use of performance-enhancing drugs, with Armstrong not merely as a participant, but as the architect and enforcer of the system. Witness after witness, former teammate after former teammate, had come forward to describe their experiences within what the report characterized as the most sophisticated, professionalized, and successful doping program that sport has ever seen. These were not the bitter accusations of defeated rivals or the desperate lies of disgraced athletes seeking to bring down a champion. These were the testimonies of men who had been there, who had participated, who had intimate knowledge of methods and procedures that had been hidden from public view for more than a decade. The evidence was not just testimonial but documentary. Financial records showing payments to doctors with expertise in performance enhancement. Medical records indicating suspicious blood values and irregular testing patterns. Communications between team members that, when decoded, revealed discussions of doping schedules and cover-up strategies. Perhaps most damaging of all were the descriptions of Armstrong's role not just as a participant in the doping program, but as its primary organizer and enforcer. Witnesses described a system of intimidation and control that ensured silence from team members, a culture where loyalty was measured not by competitive dedication, but by willingness to participate in and protect the systematic violation of sport's most fundamental rules. The report detailed how Armstrong had used his influence and resources to silence critics and whistleblowers, how he had leveraged his status as a cancer survivor and humanitarian to deflect suspicion and attack the credibility of those who dared to question his methods. The very platform that had made him an inspiration to millions had become a weapon used to maintain the fiction that supported his continued dominance. Reading the report was like watching a magic trick performed in reverse, seeing the elaborate mechanisms that had created an illusion of miraculous performance revealed in all their mundane, technical detail. The superhuman endurance that had seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human physiology was explained in terms of blood transfusions, EPO injections, and carefully timed administration of performance-enhancing substances. The 7 Tour de France victories that had stood as monuments to human potential were redefined as the products of systematic cheating conducted on an industrial scale. The comeback from cancer that had inspired millions was revealed to be not a miracle of human determination, but the result of methods that gave their practitioner advantages so significant that victory became almost inevitable. The report concluded with a recommendation that would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of Armstrong's competitive legacy. Based on the evidence presented, USADA recommended that he be stripped of all competitive results achieved after August 1, 1998, and banned from competition for life. The 7 consecutive Tour de France victories would be erased from the record books, leaving behind only empty spaces where once there had been golden achievements. In the days that followed the report's release, the cycling world struggled to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. The International Cycling Union, initially resistant to accepting USADA's findings, eventually capitulated to the weight of evidence. Sponsors began abandoning Armstrong with the swiftness of friends departing a plague victim's bedside. The Livestrong Foundation, built on his story of triumph over adversity, began the painful process of separating itself from its founder. And Lance Armstrong himself, the man who had faced down cancer and climbed mountains and inspired millions, remained silent. For the first time in his adult life, the man who had always had an answer, who had always been ready with a response to any challenge or accusation, had nothing to say. The music had stopped, and in the sudden silence that followed, the world was left to contemplate the wreckage of what had once been considered one of the greatest stories ever told. In the weeks and months that followed the USADA report, Lance Armstrong's life began to unravel with the systematic precision of a complex piece of machinery being disassembled by experts. Each day brought new revelations, new abandonments, new evidence that the man who had once seemed untouchable was now as fragile as ancient papyrus exposed to sudden light. The sponsors left first, with the calculated efficiency of investors abandoning a failing stock. Nike, which had built an entire marketing empire around Armstrong's story, terminated their relationship with a statement that managed to be both corporate and coldly personal. The company that had once proclaimed, "Cancer doesn't know what it's up against," now found itself needing to distance itself from the very inspiration that had generated hundreds of millions in revenue. Trek Bicycle Corporation, Anheuser-Busch, Radio Shack, Oakley, one by one, the corporate partners who had helped build Armstrong's commercial empire issued statements expressing disappointment and concern, as if they were surprised to discover gambling in an establishment they had been profiting from for years. The language of these departures was careful, legally vetted, designed to minimize financial exposure while maximizing moral positioning. But perhaps more painful than the corporate abandonments were the personal defections. Friends who had stood by Armstrong through the darkest days of his cancer treatment now found themselves unable to continue defending what appeared to be indefensible. The social circle that had formed around his celebrity began to contract like a dying star, leaving behind only the most loyal or the most compromised. The Livestrong Foundation, the organization that had been built as a monument to Armstrong's triumph over cancer, faced an impossible choice. They could continue to be associated with their founder and risk their mission being overshadowed by scandal, or they could separate themselves from the man whose story had given them purpose and credibility. They chose survival over loyalty, removing Armstrong from their board of directors and beginning the painful process of rebranding themselves around their mission rather than their founder. The Foundation's yellow bracelets, once worn as badges of hope and solidarity, began disappearing from wrists around the world. Some were quietly removed and discarded. Others were cut off with scissors in gestures that carried the weight of betrayal and disappointment. The simple rubber circles that had once connected millions of people to a shared belief in the power of human determination became symbols of a different kind, reminders of how completely we had been deceived. Armstrong's competitive achievements were systematically erased from official records. The Tour de France organization took the extraordinary step of declaring no winner for the years 2000 to 2005, unable to find any rider from those competitions who could be declared clean with confidence. It was as if 7 years of cycling history had been declared null and void, a competitive wasteland where no legitimate victory could be identified. The Hall of Fame inductions were revoked, the awards returned or rescinded, the records struck from official books. Armstrong's name began disappearing from cycling's official history, like a person being edited out of Soviet-era photographs, leaving behind only empty spaces that spoke more eloquently than any monument to the magnitude of what had been lost. His teammates, the men who had shared roads and victories, and what they now claimed were systematic doping programs, began speaking out with increasing frequency and detail. Their accounts painted a picture of a team environment where doping was not just accepted but required, where riders who expressed reluctance or moral reservations found themselves excluded from important races or released from their contracts. These revelations were particularly devastating because they came from men who had been portrayed as heroes in their own right. Riders who had sacrificed their individual ambitions to support Armstrong's quest for Tour de France dominance. Their transformation from loyal domestiques to accusers carried a narrative weight that pure outsider criticism could never match. The financial costs of the unraveling were staggering. Legal fees mounted as Armstrong's attorneys fought battles on multiple fronts. Endorsement money that had already been paid was demanded back by sponsors claiming breach of contract. The federal government began exploring the possibility of recovering money paid to Armstrong's team through the U.S. Postal Service sponsorship, claiming that the doping violations constituted fraud against American taxpayers. But beyond the financial and professional consequences lay something more profound and more difficult to quantify. The dissolution of a belief system that had sustained millions of people through their own struggles with illness, adversity, and the simple challenge of being human. The Lance Armstrong story had offered a narrative of hope so powerful that its destruction left behind not just disappointment, but a kind of existential void, a space where inspiration had once lived, but now only doubt remained. The man who had once been called the greatest comeback story in sports history was now experiencing the greatest fall from grace in sports history. And with each passing day, as more evidence emerged and more supporters abandoned him, it became increasingly clear that this unraveling was not temporary turbulence but permanent destruction, a dismantling so complete that reconstruction would be impossible. January 17, 2013. The night that changed everything arrived not with the dramatic thunderclap one might expect, but with the subdued lighting and careful staging of a television studio in Austin, Texas. Oprah Winfrey, the undisputed master of confession television, sat across from Lance Armstrong in an arrangement that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The fallen champion finally ready to speak his truth to the world. The interview itself had been negotiated with the precision of a diplomatic summit. Armstrong's lawyers had worked for weeks to establish parameters that would allow their client to acknowledge wrongdoing without completely destroying his remaining legal positions. Winfrey's team had pushed for maximum revelation, understanding that their audience would settle for nothing less than complete transparency. When the cameras began rolling, Armstrong appeared smaller somehow than he had in his racing days, as if the weight of carrying secrets for so long had compressed him into a more compact version of himself. Gone was the aggressive confidence that had characterized his responses to accusations throughout his career. In its place sat a man who seemed almost relieved to finally be able to stop denying what everyone already knew. The confession, when it came, was delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of a man reading from a prepared statement. "Yes," he said, when Winfrey asked directly if he had used performance-enhancing drugs during all 7 of his Tour de France victories. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, decades of denial collapsing into a single syllable that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. He admitted to using EPO, testosterone, and human growth hormone. He acknowledged blood transfusions designed to boost his red blood cell count beyond natural levels. He confirmed that he had not just participated in, but organized and enforced a systematic doping program that had operated with military-like precision throughout his competitive career. But even in confession, Armstrong seemed unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had destroyed. His admissions were clinical, almost technical in their precision, as if he were describing the mechanics of bicycle maintenance, rather than confessing to years of systematic deception that had corrupted one of sport's most prestigious competitions. When Winfrey pressed him about the human cost of his actions, the careers destroyed, the reputations ruined, the people whose lives had been damaged by his determination to maintain his secrets, Armstrong's responses revealed a man struggling to connect the dots between his actions and their consequences. He seemed genuinely surprised that people were angry with him, as if the revelation of his doping should be met with understanding rather than outrage. His explanations for why he had doped were simultaneously reasonable and inadequate. Everyone was doing it, he claimed, suggesting that he had simply been playing by the unwritten rules of professional cycling during that era. It was impossible to compete at the highest levels without pharmaceutical assistance, he argued, positioning himself not as a cheater, but as a pragmatist who had accepted the realities of his sport. The most disturbing moments of the interview came when Armstrong discussed his attacks on those who had tried to expose his doping. He admitted to orchestrating character assassination campaigns against former teammates, journalists, and anti-doping officials who had questioned his methods. He acknowledged using his platform as a cancer survivor to deflect criticism and attack the credibility of his accusers. Yet even these admissions were delivered without apparent recognition of their moral weight. Armstrong seemed to view his destruction of other people's reputations as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage in his campaign to protect his own interests. The empathy that had supposedly driven his foundation work was notably absent when discussing the human cost of his deception. The interview was broadcast over 2 nights, drawing audiences that reflected the magnitude of public interest in Armstrong's fall from grace. Viewers watched with the same morbid fascination that draws crowds to accident scenes, unable to look away from the systematic destruction of a mythology they had helped to create. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire interview was what Armstrong didn't say. He never expressed genuine remorse for the deception itself, only for getting caught. He never acknowledged that his actions had corrupted sport in ways that extended far beyond his own victories. He never seemed to understand that the real crime was not the doping, but the lies. Not the cheating, but the destruction of faith that millions of people had placed in his story. When the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, Lance Armstrong had finally told the truth about his competitive career. But the truth, delivered so late and with such obvious reluctance, felt less like redemption than like the final act of vandalism against his own legacy. He had spent years destroying his critics. Now he was completing the job by destroying himself. In the aftermath of the Oprah confession, the world found itself grappling not just with the facts of Lance Armstrong's deception, but with the larger questions his fall raised about the nature of heroism, the power of narrative, and our own complicity in constructing mythologies that serve our psychological needs more than they reflect reality. The legal consequences cascaded through Armstrong's life with the inexorable force of an avalanche. The United States Department of Justice, which had previously declined to pursue criminal charges, now found itself under renewed pressure to investigate whether Armstrong's use of federal sponsorship money, while engaged in systematic doping, constituted fraud. The potential financial liability was staggering. Millions of dollars in sponsorship money that might have to be repaid, along with treble damages that could multiply the cost into figures that would bankrupt even a man who had once been worth an estimated $125 million. Former teammates who had been intimidated into silence during Armstrong's reign of dominance began speaking with increasing boldness about their experiences within what they characterized as a culture of fear. Their stories painted a picture of a team environment where loyalty was enforced through a combination of financial incentives and psychological intimidation, where riders who showed reluctance to participate in doping programs found themselves excluded from important races or pushed out of professional cycling altogether. The sport of cycling itself was forced to confront its own role in enabling and protecting the systematic doping that had corrupted competition at its highest levels. The International Cycling Union, which had administered drug tests that consistently failed to detect Armstrong's use of performance-enhancing substances, faced questions about whether their testing protocols had been inadequate or their officials had been complicit in covering up positive results. Investigations revealed a pattern of suspicious behavior by cycling officials that suggested the sport's governing body had been more interested in protecting its most marketable star than in ensuring fair competition. The UCI had accepted donations from Armstrong totaling more than $100,000 during the period when he was most actively doping, creating at minimum the appearance of a conflict of interest that undermined the credibility of the entire anti-doping system. The revelations forced a broader examination of how we construct our heroes and what we expect from them. Armstrong's story had been so compelling precisely because it offered a simple narrative in a complex world. Good triumphing over evil, determination conquering adversity, the individual human spirit proving itself capable of transcending any limitation. We had needed this story to be true with an urgency that perhaps blinded us to evidence that might have suggested otherwise. Media organizations that had celebrated Armstrong's achievements for years now found themselves examining their own role in perpetuating what they now recognized as a massive deception. Journalists who had written glowing profiles began asking uncomfortable questions about their own skepticism, about whether their desire for an inspiring story had led them to overlook warning signs that might have been apparent to more critical observers. The cancer community, which had embraced Armstrong as a symbol of hope and possibility, struggled with the realization that their inspiration had been built on a foundation of lies. The Livestrong Foundation, despite its efforts to distance itself from its founder, saw donations decline as supporters grappled with the disconnect between the organization's mission and the character of the man who had given it life. Yet, perhaps the most profound reckoning was taking place in the minds and hearts of ordinary people who had drawn strength from Armstrong's story during their own battles with illness, adversity, and the simple challenge of getting through difficult days. For these individuals, the revelation of Armstrong's deception was not just a sports scandal, but a personal betrayal that forced them to re-examine the sources of their own hope and resilience. Letters poured into newspapers and online forums from cancer survivors who had worn Livestrong bracelets through chemotherapy treatments, from athletes who had pushed through pain while thinking of Armstrong's example, from parents who had told their children that anything was possible if they believed strongly enough and worked hard enough. These people had not just admired Armstrong, they had internalized his story as part of their own identity, and his fall forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between inspiration and truth. Some found ways to separate the message from the messenger, arguing that the hope they had drawn from Armstrong's story remained valid even if the story itself had been false. Others felt a deeper sense of betrayal, as if they had been made accomplices in their own deception. The psychological impact of Armstrong's fall extended far beyond the world of sports, touching anyone who had ever invested emotional energy in the belief that individual determination could overcome any obstacle. The financial reckoning proved to be as devastating as the emotional one. Lawsuits proliferated like wildfire, with former sponsors, teammates, competitors, and business partners all seeking compensation for damages they claimed to have suffered as a result of Armstrong's deception. The Sunday Times of London, which had paid Armstrong £300,000 to settle a libel case after publishing allegations about his doping, immediately began proceedings to recover their money along with interest and legal costs. SCA Promotions, a Texas-based insurance company that had been forced to pay Armstrong millions in performance bonuses after initially refusing to do so based on doping suspicions, filed suit seeking return of their payments plus additional damages. The case would eventually result in Armstrong being ordered to pay over $10 million, the largest award in the company's history. The United States Postal Service, whose sponsorship of Armstrong's team had been funded with taxpayer money, joined a whistleblower lawsuit seeking to recover the $32 million they had paid during their sponsorship period. The case, filed under the False Claims Act, potentially exposed Armstrong to triple damages that could have reached nearly $100 million. Perhaps most symbolically painful was the demand from the International Olympic Committee that Armstrong return the bronze medal he had won in the 2000 Sydney Olympics. The medal, which had represented the culmination of his comeback from cancer, was surrendered quietly without ceremony, joining the growing pile of honors and achievements that had been stripped away in the aftermath of his confession. The cascade of legal and financial consequences created a feedback loop that seemed to accelerate Armstrong's fall from grace. Each new lawsuit generated fresh headlines that reminded the public of his deception. Each financial settlement reduced his resources for fighting additional legal battles. Each returned award or stripped title reinforced the narrative of a man being systematically erased from the history he had once dominated. Armstrong's attempts to rebuild his reputation and financial position met with consistent failure. His investment in Uber, which might have restored his fortune if he had been allowed to maintain his stake, became entangled in legal proceedings as creditors sought to claim any valuable assets. Business ventures that might have succeeded for a controversial but sympathetic figure foundered when attached to someone widely perceived as irredeemably dishonest. The man who had once commanded six-figure speaking fees found that corporate audiences were no longer interested in hearing from him. The autobiography that had topped bestseller lists was quietly removed from bookstore shelves. Television networks that had once competed for the rights to broadcast his races now avoided any programming that might remind viewers of their own role in promoting his mythology. In this comprehensive reckoning, Lance Armstrong discovered that the modern media landscape, which had amplified his fame to unprecedented heights, was equally capable of accelerating his destruction. The same social media platforms that had spread his inspirational message now carried viral condemnations of his character. The same global communication networks that had made him an international icon now ensured that his disgrace would be equally universal and instantaneous. The reckoning was not just personal, but cultural, forcing American society to confront uncomfortable questions about its relationship with celebrity, its hunger for inspirational narratives, and its willingness to overlook warning signs when the story being told serves psychological and emotional needs. Armstrong's fall became a case study in the dangers of hero worship, a cautionary tale about the risks of investing too much faith in the perfection of public figures. By 2014, Lance Armstrong had become a ghost haunting the margins of the world he had once ruled. The transformation from global icon to pariah was so complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe they were the same person. Where once he had been the most recognizable cyclist on Earth, now he rode alone through the hills around Austin, Texas, his presence on the local training routes more likely to clear paths than attract followers. The exile was not just geographic but existential. Armstrong found himself cut off from the sport that had defined his identity for decades. banned for life from any competition sanctioned by the World Anti-Doping Agency. The punishment was comprehensive, extending beyond professional cycling to include marathons, triathlons, and any other organized athletic competition where drug testing protocols were in place. His attempts to participate in unsanctioned events met with organized resistance from other competitors and event organizers who viewed his presence as a distraction at best, and a contamination at worst. The athletic community that had once welcomed him as a conquering hero now treated him like a carrier of a communicable disease, someone whose very participation undermined the integrity of whatever competition he entered. The social isolation was perhaps even more painful than the athletic exile. Friends who had been part of his inner circle during the glory years now found themselves unable to maintain relationships that had become professionally and socially toxic. The celebrity social network that revolves around wealth, fame, and achievement quietly excluded someone whose name had become synonymous with deception and disgrace. Austin, Texas, the city that had once proclaimed itself the home of an American hero, now seemed to shrink around Armstrong like an uncomfortable garment. Restaurants, where he had once been treated like royalty, became places where his presence generated whispers and surreptitious smartphone photography. The local cycling community, which had basked in the reflected glory of his achievements, now avoided association with someone who had become an embarrassment to the sport they loved. His children, who had grown up as the sons and daughters of one of the most famous athletes in the world, now found themselves dealing with the complex legacy of a father whose name carried connotations that extended far beyond sport. The simple act of introducing themselves became fraught with complications, as their surname inevitably generated questions and assumptions that forced them to navigate the gap between private love and public disgrace. The financial pressures of multiple lawsuits and settlements forced Armstrong to liquidate assets that had once symbolized his success. The Austin mansion, where he had entertained celebrities and politicians, was sold. The collection of luxury cars was reduced to essentials. The art collection that had decorated his walls was dispersed to raise funds for legal settlements. Armstrong's attempts to generate income through podcasts, speaking engagements, and business ventures met with consistent failure, as sponsors and partners discovered that association with his name generated more negative publicity than positive. The personal brand that had once been worth hundreds of millions of dollars had become radioactive, impossible to monetize in any conventional way. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Armstrong's exile was the silence that surrounded it. The man who had once been the subject of countless magazine profiles, television documentaries, and news stories now found that media outlets had little interest in covering his daily existence. His fall from grace had been so complete and so well documented that there seemed to be nothing left to say about him. The silence was broken only occasionally, when legal proceedings required his testimony, or when anniversary dates prompted retrospective examinations of his scandal. These brief moments in the public eye served mainly to remind audiences of how far he had fallen, and how completely he had been erased from contemporary relevance. In this exile, Armstrong was forced to confront the reality that his identity had been so completely intertwined with his public persona that its destruction left him struggling to understand who he was when stripped of fame, acclaim, and the adoration of millions. The psychological challenges of this transformation were immense, requiring him to reconstruct a sense of self that was not dependent on external validation or public recognition. The daily routines that had once been structured around the demands of professional competition and celebrity appearances now stretched out like empty corridors, filled with time that had no particular purpose or direction. The discipline that had once been focused on achieving victory in bicycle races now had no outlet, no goal toward which it could be directed. Armstrong's relationship with cycling itself became complicated and painful. The sport that had given him everything, fame, fortune, purpose, identity, was now forbidden to him in any official capacity. His continued riding was purely personal, a private conversation with roads and mountains that held memories of what had once been possible. The hills around Austin became his monastery, the long training rides his meditation practice. But where once these roads had been stages for preparation toward greater glory, now they were simply places where a fallen man could experience brief moments of the physical sensation that had once made him feel godlike. In this exile, Lance Armstrong discovered what many public figures learn too late, that when your entire identity is built on external achievements and public recognition, the removal of those foundations leaves you standing on ground that may not be solid enough to support the weight of ordinary human existence. In the quiet years that followed his exile from the sport he had once dominated, Lance Armstrong found himself haunted, not by what he had lost, but by the weight of what he remembered. Memory, that most unreliable of narrators, began to edit and re-edit the story of his life, creating versions of events that seemed to shift depending on the light in which they were examined. There were mornings when he would wake and, in the brief moment between sleep and consciousness, forget what had happened to his life. In those fleeting seconds, he was still the 7-time Tour de France champion, still the cancer survivor who had inspired millions, still the man whose yellow jerseys hung in a place of honor rather than shame. But reality would always intrude, arriving with the weight of a physical presence that pressed down on his chest like accumulated earth. The training rides that had once been purposeful preparation for competition became something else entirely. Archaeological expeditions through a landscape littered with the artifacts of his former life. Every climb he had once conquered as a professional now carried the dual weight of triumph and deception. The mountains that had once celebrated his victories now seemed to judge his methods, transforming familiar routes into prosecutors, offering evidence of systematic fraud. He would pass landmarks that triggered cascades of memory. The training camp where blood had been drawn and stored. The hotel where EPO had been administered. The remote location where teammates had been initiated into the systematic doping program that had powered his dominance. These places had not changed, but their meaning had been completely transformed, like archaeological sites whose significance is reinterpreted by new discoveries. The photographs that documented his career became particularly difficult to examine. Images that had once celebrated peak human performance now revealed themselves as documentation of elaborate deception. The smiles on podiums, the raised arms in victory, the yellow jerseys draped across shoulders, all of it now carried the knowledge of what had been required to achieve those moments. Most haunting were the photographs with cancer patients, the hospital visits, the foundation events where his presence had offered hope to people facing their own mortality. These images forced Armstrong to confront the most complex aspect of his legacy, the genuine good that had grown from the soil of systematic deception. The question of whether inspiration based on lies retained any value was one that seemed to have no clear answer. His relationship with his own children became a daily navigation of this complex legacy. They had grown up knowing their father as a hero, and the revelation of his systematic doping had forced them to reconstruct their understanding of the man who had raised them. The process was painful for all involved, requiring conversations about integrity, legacy, and the difference between the public person and the private father. Armstrong found himself struggling to explain not just what he had done, but why he had done it, particularly to children who had inherited his name and would carry its associations throughout their lives. The simple moral frameworks that govern parent-child relationships, telling the truth, setting good examples, teaching right from wrong, had been complicated by a father whose most celebrated achievements had been built on systematic deception. The passage of time did little to ease the psychological weight of these contradictions. If anything, the years in exile intensified his awareness of the gap between who he had been perceived to be and who he actually was. The longer he lived with the knowledge of his systematic doping, the more difficult it became to understand how he had maintained the deception for so long, even to himself. There were moments when Armstrong seemed to approach something resembling genuine remorse, times when the human cost of his actions appeared to penetrate the psychological armor he had constructed around his choices. But these moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by the self-justification and rationalization that had allowed him to maintain his deception for years. The isolation of exile gave him time to examine the systematic destruction he had inflicted on others, the teammates whose careers had been destroyed for telling the truth, the journalists whose reporting had been dismissed as malicious speculation, the anti-doping officials who had been portrayed as incompetent or corrupt for doing their jobs. The weight of these individual tragedies was perhaps heavier than the destruction of his own reputation. Yet, even in examining this damage, Armstrong seemed unable to fully connect his actions to their consequences in a way that generated appropriate emotional response. The empathy that had supposedly driven his foundation work remained curiously absent when applied to the victims of his systematic campaign to maintain his secrets. The memories that seemed to carry the most weight were not of victory or defeat, but of the quiet moments when he had made crucial decisions about truth and deception. The choice to participate in systematic doping, the decision to attack critics, the commitment to maintain lies even when their exposure seemed inevitable. These were the moments that haunted him most deeply. In the silence of his exile, Armstrong was forced to confront the reality that the systematic doping had been only part of the larger pattern of deception that had defined his adult life. The lies had metastasized beyond sport into every aspect of his public persona, creating a version of himself that bore little relationship to reality. The weight of memory became a kind of penance, a daily reminder of choices that could not be unmade, and consequences that could not be undone. But whether this weight would eventually produce genuine understanding and remorse remained an open question, one that only time and continued reflection might answer. As we approach the end of this journey through the rise and fall of Lance Armstrong, we find ourselves confronted with a story that refuses the clean resolution that conventional narratives demand. There is no redemption arc here, no final act of understanding that transforms tragedy into wisdom, no epilogue that offers comfort to those who invested so much faith in a story that proved to be built on lies. Armstrong continues to live in Austin, Texas, a city that has learned to coexist with its most famous and infamous resident. He rides the same roads where he once trained for Tour de France victories, but now his presence generates curiosity rather than reverence, questions rather than inspiration. The man who once commanded the attention of the world now moves through his daily life as a private citizen, dealing with the complex legacy of his public deception. The cycling world has moved on, developing new heroes and narratives to replace those that were destroyed by the revelations about systematic doping in the Armstrong era. The Tour de France continues, its yellow jersey draped across the shoulders of riders who compete under more stringent testing protocols and supposedly cleaner conditions. But the sport bears permanent scars from the Armstrong years, a wariness about heroic narratives and dominant performances that reflects hard-learned lessons about the dangers of believing too completely in athletic perfection. The Live Strong Foundation continues its work supporting cancer patients and survivors, having successfully separated its mission from its founder's reputation. The organization has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for cancer research and support programs, creating a complex legacy where genuine good emerged from systematic deception. The yellow bracelets that once connected millions of people to Armstrong's story now serve as historical artifacts, reminders of a time when hope was packaged in rubber and sold in the name of inspiration. The broader questions raised by Armstrong's fall remain largely unresolved. How do we construct heroes in a media-saturated world where the pressure to maintain perfection is overwhelming? What responsibility do audiences bear for demanding inspirational narratives that may be too good to be true? How do we separate the value of hope and inspiration from the integrity of the sources that provide them? The anti-doping system that exposed Armstrong's systematic cheating has itself evolved, becoming more sophisticated in its methods and more aggressive in its investigations. But questions remain about whether the sport of cycling, or any sport conducted at the highest levels of human performance, can ever be completely clean, whether the incentives for enhancement will always outweigh the consequences of detection. Armstrong's own story continues to evolve, though largely out of public view. He has attempted various forms of rehabilitation, from podcasts to business ventures to charitable work, but none have successfully restored his reputation or his financial position. The man who once seemed capable of conquering any challenge has discovered that some forms of destruction are irreversible. Some trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. The legal consequences of his systematic doping continue to reverberate through courts and settlement negotiations. The financial reckoning that began with his confession shows no signs of reaching a final resolution, suggesting that the cost of his deception will continue to accumulate for years to come. Perhaps most significantly, Armstrong's story has become a permanent part of American cultural history, a cautionary tale taught in journalism schools, business schools, and ethics classes around the world. The narrative of his rise and fall serves as a case study in the dangers of hero worship, the importance of skeptical journalism, and the complex relationship between inspiration and truth. Yet, even as we examine the wreckage of what was once considered one of sport's greatest stories, we must acknowledge the human complexity that prevents easy moral judgments. Armstrong's systematic doping was inexcusable. His attacks on critics were deplorable. His maintenance of deception for years was morally corrupt. But he was also genuinely a cancer survivor. His foundation did raise hundreds of millions for important research and support programs, and his story, however flawed, did provide hope to people facing their own struggles with mortality and adversity. The challenge of his legacy lies in holding these contradictions simultaneously, acknowledging the genuine harm caused by his deception while recognizing the complex human being who was capable of both systematic fraud and genuine compassion, sometimes within the same time period, sometimes in response to the same situations. As Armstrong continues to age and the immediate impact of his scandal recedes into history, the story of his rise and fall will likely be remembered not as the tale of a villain, but as something more complex and more troubling. The story of how individual corruption can infect entire systems, how the pursuit of perfection can lead to systematic deception, and how our collective need for heroes can blind us to evidence that might otherwise be impossible to ignore. The yellow jerseys that once hung in places of honor have been returned, the records have been erased, the medals have been surrendered. But the questions raised by Lance Armstrong's systematic deception remain unanswered, hanging in the air like morning mist that refuses to lift, reminding us that some stories resist conclusion, some damage cannot be repaired, and some falls from grace echo through history long after the individual who fell has been forgotten. In the end, perhaps that is the most honest way to leave this story. Unfinished, unresolved, a reminder that real life rarely provides the clean endings that our narratives demand. Lance Armstrong's rise and fall became one of the defining stories of the early 21st century. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about truth, inspiration, and the price we are willing to pay for the stories we need to believe. The roads around Austin continue to wind through the hills, where a fallen champion still rides, carrying with him the weight of what he accomplished and what he destroyed, what he inspired and what he corrupted. He pedals through landscapes littered with the artifacts of a story that refuses to end. A man forever cycling through the ruins of his own mythology, searching perhaps for something that was lost long before his confession, something that may never be found again. And we, the witnesses to his rise and fall, are left to make our own peace with the story we helped create, the hero we helped build, and the lessons must learn from watching our agods prove mortal in the harsh light of truth.